She stood behind the bar counting crumpled singles and quarters by lamplight, while an eviction notice from Silas Vane's Development Corp. Sat on the counter demanding $22,000 in 14 days. The diner had been the only thing her husband left her before the wildfire took him 3 years ago, along with debts she'd never known existed. In the back room, her 6-year-old daughter Junie slept beneath a threadbare blanket, clutching the stuffed rabbit that was the last gift from a father she barely remembered. Ilara's hands shook as she reread Vane's latest message. Final warning, Mrs. Vance. 12 days left. After that, the county handles it. You don't want that embarrassment. She killed the phone screen, jaw clenched. That vulture would never take what her family had built. Then engines roared through the storm. Not one vehicle. 3 white SUVs cutting through the whiteout like knives through silk, headlights blinding against the endless white. Ilara's breath caught as 15 men emerged in dark tactical gear, moving with the precision of soldiers, fanning out across her parking lot as if securing enemy territory. The lead man stepped onto the porch, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an emerald green suit that looked like it cost more than her entire debt. Dark hair dusted with snow. A serpentine tattoo crawled up his neck into his jawline. His eyes, sharp, cold, calculating, swept over her like she was a problem to be assessed and solved. "We need somewhere safe, please." His voice was gravel and granite, accented and weary. "My men are tired. We do not wish for trouble." Ilara stood frozen, $45 to her name, a sleeping child behind her. 15 armed strangers demanding entry. She didn't know this man was Minho, second in command of a Korean syndicate whose name made powerful men disappear. She didn't know he'd spent 10 years turning grief into an empire after failing to save his 17-year-old sister from kidnappers in Seoul. She only knew the storm was killing, and she had to choose. If this story of the protector and the survivor has you hooked, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe so you won't miss what happens when Ilara opens that door. But here's the twist she'll never see coming. The most dangerous man she's ever met is about to be undone by a 6-year-old girl with her father's eyes. The man with the serpent tattoo stood in the center of the room like a general surveying a battlefield. He slipped off his emerald coat, folded it with precision that bordered on ritual, and laid it across the back of a chair. Beneath was a black shirt tailored so perfectly it might have been sewn directly onto his frame. He rolled his sleeves to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a small tattoo at his wrist. Korean characters Ilara couldn't decipher. Then he turned toward her. For the first time, she felt him truly looking. Not past her, not through her, but at her. His gaze traveled from her wild curls escaping their ponytail, down the stained apron tied around her waist, to her chapped hands still gripping the edge of the bar. She was a mess. 3 years of fighting alone had carved hollows beneath her dark brown eyes, had stolen the softness from her full lips. They had left her looking like exactly what she was, a woman hanging on by her fingernails. His expression didn't change, didn't soften with pity or harden with judgment. He simply looked at her the way a jeweler might examine an uncut diamond, seeing something others missed. "How much?" His voice cut through the silence. Ilara blinked. "What?" "For 1 night. 15 men. Food and shelter." He spoke as if negotiating a business contract, not asking a widow for charity during a blizzard. Her mind raced. The tip jar held $45. The eviction notice demanded $22,000. These men wore suits that could feed Junie for 6 months. She thought of her daughter sleeping in the back room, thought of the kerosene they didn't have, thought of the debt that would bury them in 12 days. She named a figure 3 times her normal rate. Let him think she was gouging him. Let him walk away offended. Minho didn't blink, didn't counter, didn't even pause. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out a wallet of black leather, and counted off a stack of bills so thick Ilara's throat went dry. He set it on the bar between them like a chess piece claiming territory. Keep the change. Then he turned away, dismissing her as if she'd already ceased to exist. The stack of cash sat there, screaming. Alara stared at it, her pulse hammering in her ears. She'd asked for $300. He'd given her $2,000. People who threw money around like that either had too much or needed something worth far more. Around her, the 15 men moved with unnerving efficiency. A heavy-set man with gentle eyes and surprisingly nimble hands approached, though his smile warmed despite the cold radiating from his companions. "Ma'am, I'm Bruno. May I use your kitchen?" Alara's hands trembled as she led him through the narrow hallway. Her kitchen was a disaster, the fridge nearly empty except for half a dozen eggs, a brick of cheese hardening at the edges, wilted greens she'd planned to stretch into soup, and bacon she'd been saving for Junie's birthday breakfast. Bruno opened the fridge and studied its contents like an artist assessing a blank canvas. She waited for complaint, for disappointment, for the inevitable question about why she'd agreed to feed 15 men when she could barely feed one child. Instead, he nodded. "It'll do. Flour, onions." She pointed toward the dry pantry, throat too tight to speak. Bruno's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime transforming nothing into something. Within minutes, the kitchen filled with the sound of chopping, the hiss of oil in a pan, the rich smell of onions caramelizing. Alara returned to the main room and stopped short. They'd transformed the space completely. The ancient sofa had been pushed into the corner, clearing the center. Blankets were stacked with military precision. One man coaxed the dying fireplace back to roaring life. Another checked every windowsill, his fingers testing for drafts with the meticulousness of someone whose life depended on details. And in the farthest corner, where shadows pooled deepest, Minho sat in her mother's old armchair, the one with the worn velvet arms and the spring that poked through if you sat wrong. He'd claimed it without asking, one leg crossed over the other, fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the armrest. He wasn't helping, wasn't giving orders, just sitting, watching. Alara felt his gaze like a physical weight pressing against her spine. She tried to ignore it, busying herself with clearing the bar, but every time she glanced up, those dark eyes were tracking her movements. Not leering, not hungry in the way men sometimes looked at her when they thought she was desperate enough to be bought. This was different, clinical, assessing, like he was solving an equation and she was the variable he hadn't yet identified. She bent to stow the cash in the hidden compartment beneath the register, and realized her mistake too late. The eviction notice was still there, crisp and damning, with Silas Vane's letterhead and that obscene number printed in bold, $22,000. Her hands shook as she shoved the paper into her apron pocket, but when she looked up, her heart stopped. Minho was staring directly at her, not at the room, not at his men, at the pocket where she'd just hidden her shame. He'd seen it. She knew he'd seen it because something shifted behind those impenetrable eyes, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps calculation, the look a predator gave when it scented blood. Alara held her breath, waiting for him to speak, to ask, to push. But Minho only turned his attention back to the room, to his men arranging her diner into a fortress, as if the paper in her pocket didn't exist at all. Somehow, his silence was more terrifying than any question could have been. 3 a.m. found Alara still awake, perched on a stool behind the bar, listening to the steady breathing of 15 men scattered across her common room like sleeping wolves. Bruno's soup had been better than anything she'd cooked in that kitchen in 3 years, rich and impossible, conjured from her pathetic scraps. They'd eaten in silence, cleaned with the same unnerving efficiency, then drifted to sleep without needing instruction. Now the room lay submerged in darkness, except for firelight dancing across the ceiling and wind still screaming against the windows. Alara was about to check on Junie when small footsteps whispered across the wooden floor. Her heart clenched. She turned to find her daughter standing at the hallway's end, squinting against the flickering light, arms wrapped around her star-patterned pillow. Junie's dark curls, so much like Alara's, stood up in sleep-wild spirals. Her brown skin looked golden in the firelight, and her eyes, wide and uncertain, scanned the room full of strangers. "Mama," her voice was thick with sleep. "There are too many people. I can't sleep." Alara started toward her, ready to scoop Junie up and carry her back to safety. But then she realized her daughter wasn't looking at her. Junie was staring into the dark corner where Minho still sat in that chair, eyes open and alert as if sleep had never crossed his mind. "Junie, come here." Alara's voice came out strangled, but the child was already walking toward him, toward the most dangerous man in the room, toward the serpent in the emerald suit. Alara's feet felt nailed to the floor. Every instinct screamed to run, to grab her daughter, to put herself between Junie and this man whose very stillness radiated violence. But her body wouldn't obey. Junie stopped less than 3 feet from Minho, tilting her head up to study him with the fearless curiosity of a 6-year-old who hadn't yet learned that monsters wore human faces. Minho watched the child approach. His expression remained unreadable, carved from stone. When Junie planted herself in front of him, he didn't move, didn't speak, simply waited. Then something Alara never expected happened. Slowly, with a deliberateness that made her chest ache, Minho rose from the chair and dropped to one knee, lowering himself to eye level with her daughter, a man who commanded killers kneeling before a child in worn pajamas. "Hello." His voice had changed, still deep, still rough, but stripped of the cold edge he'd used with Alara. "You are the keeper's daughter?" Junie nodded, her eyes fixed on his face with uncomfortable intensity. "I'm Junie. Who are you?" "I am Minho." Junie's small hand lifted, and Alara's heart nearly stopped as her daughter's finger pointed toward the scar cutting through Minho's left eyebrow, a pale line that disappeared into his hairline. "Does it hurt there?" Silence stretched. Alara saw Minho's shoulders tense, saw his jaw tighten. She was ready to rush forward, to pull Junie away, to apologize. But then he answered, his voice so soft she almost missed it. "A long time ago. It doesn't hurt anymore." Junie nodded with the solemn gravity of a child who'd lived through loss. "It hurts for me too. When my daddy died." The words punched through Alara's chest. She wanted to run to her daughter, wanted to cover Junie's mouth, wanted to unhear the pain in that small voice. "My mama says the hurt doesn't go away," Junie continued, oblivious to the tears burning Alara's eyes. "But it gets smaller, a little every day, until you can carry it without falling down." Minho didn't speak. He simply looked at this 6-year-old child, and Alara watched something crack in that granite face. Not a smile, not tears, but a fracture in the ice he'd built around himself. "Your mother is wise." His voice carried a weight that suggested he knew exactly what kind of hurt Junie meant, the kind that carved holes in your chest and never quite filled in. Junie grinned suddenly, the shift so abrupt it was almost jarring. "I like you. You don't talk as much as other grown-ups." Then she turned and ran back to Alara, wrapping small arms around her mother's legs. "I'm sleepy now. Can you take me back?" Alara bent and lifted Junie into her arms, but her eyes never left Minho. He was still kneeling on the floor, watching them with an expression she couldn't decipher. In that moment, she didn't see a predator. She saw a man who'd lost something precious and had just been reminded of it by a child who knew nothing about serpents or syndicates or the cost of arriving 3 hours too late. She carried Junie back to the bedroom, tucked her beneath threadbare blankets, and kissed her forehead. When she returned to the common room, Minho had reclaimed his chair. But something had changed. The way he sat, the way he watched her cross the room, the careful distance he maintained felt less like indifference and more like restraint, like he was holding something back. Alara didn't know if that made him more dangerous or less. Morning came gray and grudging. The blizzard had gentled to a sullen hiss, snow still falling but without the rage that had buried the pass the night before. Alara stood at the window, watching the road gradually emerge from white nothing, and wondered if she wanted these men to leave at all. The answer came in the form of 3 black pickup trucks tearing up her driveway, engines roaring like wounded animals, tires grinding against snow and gravel. Her stomach turned to ice. She recognized the lead vehicle instantly, Silas Vane. The trucks skidded to aggressive stops, doors slamming open before the engines even cut. Vane emerged first, silver hair impeccably styled despite the weather, wool coat tailored to intimidate, a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. 6 men followed him inside, broad-shouldered and stone-faced, the kind hired to threaten simply by existing. Vane shoved through her door without knocking, without waiting, as if he already owned the place. "Elara!" His voice dripped false warmth. "Heard the storm finally broke. Thought I'd check on you." His smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Only 10 days left on our agreement. I wanted to make one final offer before things get complicated." Elara opened her mouth to tell him exactly where he could shove his offer, but Vane stopped mid-stride. The smile froze on his face like January water turning to ice. His eyes swept the room, and Elara watched the color drain from his skin as he realized he hadn't walked into an empty diner. 15 men were scattered throughout the space, some seated, some standing. While all of them already turned toward the door the moment Vane entered. They didn't move, didn't speak, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and in the dark corner, Minho slowly rose to his feet. He didn't hurry, didn't waste a single motion, simply stood, stepped into the light, and let his presence do the talking. Vane went pale. Not metaphorically pale, actually visibly drained of blood. Minho. The name fell from his lips like a curse. Minho inclined his head in a small, almost polite nod. "Vane, I heard you were doing business in the mountains." His voice was silk over steel, "causing trouble for a friend of mine." The word friend made Vane's eyes dart between Minho and Elara, confusion and fear warring across his face. How could this woman, this nobody widow he'd been squeezing for months, be connected to him? "This is just business," Vane said, trying to steady his voice and failing. "She owes me money, legal debt, nothing to do with you." "She gave me shelter during the storm." Minho's hands slid into his pockets with lazy confidence. "In my culture, that matters. Tell me, Vane, does hospitality mean anything in yours, or do you only believe in forcing widows from their homes?" Vane swallowed hard, his throat working. "She has 10 days. If she can't pay, the courts decide. That's the law." Minho smiled. It was the coldest thing Elara had ever seen. "I'm very good with the law, Vane, even better with what exists beyond it." He tilted his head, dark eyes cutting into the other man. "You should leave, before I decide your presence is an insult that requires repayment." For a moment, Vane looked like he might argue. Elara saw it in the way his hands clenched, in the way his jaw worked. But then he simply turned and hurried toward the door, his 6 hired thugs trailing after him like scolded dogs. At the threshold, Vane stopped, looked back at Elara. "This isn't over." His voice shook too badly to sound threatening. Then he was gone, trucks roaring back down the mountain. Only when the sound faded did Elara realize she'd been holding her breath. Minho turned to look at her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, something like satisfaction flickered in those dark eyes. "He won't come back," Minho said quietly. "Not while I'm here." Elara wanted to thank him, wanted to ask what he'd meant by friend, wanted to know why a man like him would stand between her and a vulture like Vane. But before she could speak, Junie's voice rang out from the hallway. "Mama, is the bad man gone?" And Elara watched Minho's expression shift again, that same crack in the ice she'd seen last night, the look of a man haunted by a child he'd failed to protect, now standing in front of one he wouldn't. Vane didn't come back the next day, or the day after. The blizzard eased to intermittent flurries, and the road slowly cleared, and Elara began to believe Minho had been right. The vulture had been scared off. She should have known better. The smell woke her at 2 a.m, not a sound, a smell, smoke, thick and acrid, seeping through the window frame and dragging her from restless sleep. Ilara jolted upright, heart already racing. For 3 seconds, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Mai couldn't do anything but remember the night the sheriff knocked on her door to tell her Garrett had died in a wildfire, that they'd found his body in the Forestry Service truck after the flames finally died. Then instinct kicked in. She ran to Junie's room, shook her daughter awake, pulled her from the bed while the child was still groggy and frightened. "Mama, what?" "Outside, now!" Through the window, she saw it. The woodshed behind the diner was burning, flames licking at the night sky like red tongues, sparks spiraling upward into the dark. She pushed Junie through the front door, made sure she was safe and far from the fire, then grabbed the extinguisher and ran around back. The shed was already half consumed, beyond saving, but she had to keep the flames from spreading to the diner. The sound of breaking glass from the front of the house stopped her cold. Junie. She ran back, her lungs burning, and found her daughter standing frozen on the porch, staring at something on the ground. A burlap sack lay among shattered glass from the living room window. Something orange protruded from its opening. Whiskers. Junie's cat. The orange tabby she'd rescued as a kitten 2 years ago. The animal that slept curled against her daughter's chest every night. Ilara pulled Junie back, covered her eyes, but she was too late. The child had already seen. "Whiskers?" Junie's voice was small and shaking. "Why is Whiskers there? Why isn't Whiskers moving?" Ilara held her daughter, turned her face into her chest, but her own eyes locked on the white paper pinned inside the sack. Oh, the handwriting was crude, sharp. Deadlines can be delayed, accidents can't. Next time it won't be the cat. Rage and terror fought for dominance in Ilara's chest. Vane. She knew it was him with the certainty of knowing her own name. No proof, no witnesses, just the absolute knowledge that the vulture had come back in the dark to deliver his message. Junie began to cry, the broken, hiccuping sobs of a 6-year-old who'd already lost her father and was now losing the only other thing she'd loved unconditionally. Ilara held her daughter while the fire still crackled behind them, while the threat lay beside the small body, while she realized with terrible clarity that she couldn't protect Junie alone. Not from men like Vane, not from people who killed innocent animals to make a point. She reached into her pocket with shaking hands and pulled out her phone. The contact was still there. The number Minho's second-in-command had left before they departed. She'd sworn she'd never call it, sworn she'd handle this herself. But as Junie sobbed against her chest, as smoke still burned her throat, as the words next time echoed in her mind, Ilara understood she had no choice. She pressed call. The man answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Vance." "I need him." Her voice broke. "Please, I need him here." Silence. Then, 6 hours. The line went dead. Ilara held her daughter in the cold December air, surrounded by ash and threats and the body of a cat, and waited for the monster she'd invited into her home to come back and do what monsters did best. Behind them, the woodshed collapsed in a shower of sparks. The fire department arrived 20 minutes later. Then the sheriff, useless, just like always, taking notes but promising nothing because Silas Vane owned half the county. Ilara answered questions mechanically, her arms never leaving Junie, who'd gone silent and hollow-eyed. By the time dawn broke gray and cold, Ilara had buried Whiskers in the frozen ground behind the diner, wrapped in Junie's baby blanket because her daughter insisted. And she'd cleaned the glass, burned the note, and was sitting on the porch steps when she heard them coming. 2 black SUVs, not 15, tearing up the road like vengeance given wheels. Minho stepped out first. Even from a distance, Ilara could see the difference. This wasn't the man who'd asked politely for shelter. This wasn't the stranger who'd knelt before her daughter. This was something else. Something colder, sharper. A predator that had just caught the scent of blood. 5 men followed him, not the gentle Bruno or the easy-smiling Tommy. These were specialists, the kind whose eyes carried death before they spoke. Minho crossed the distance between them in long strides, and when he stopped in front of her, Ilara saw murder living behind those dark eyes. "Tell me everything." 2 words. No greeting, no comfort, Nothing wasted. So she told him. The smoke, the fire, the sound of breaking glass, the burlap sack with Junie's cat inside, and the note that promised her daughter would be next. Minho listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging. But Alara saw his hands slowly curl into fists, saw the muscle in his jaw jump as if he were grinding something to powder between his teeth. When she finished, he held out his hand. The note. I burned it. What did it say? Exactly. She recited it word for word, watched something dangerous flash through his eyes. Where is Junie? Inside. She won't eat, won't speak. Minho turned and looked at the diner, at the window where a small face was pressed against the glass, watching. His expression shifted, that same fracture in the ice she'd seen before. Then he turned back to Alara, and his voice dropped to something that made her skin prickle. Silas Vane will wish he were dead. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, a vow, the kind carved in blood. Alara wanted to speak, wanted to ask what he planned to do, wanted to beg him not to destroy himself in the process of protecting them. But before she could say anything, Minho walked past her into the diner. She followed and found him kneeling in front of Junie, who stood small and hollow-eyed in the middle of the room. I'm sorry about Whiskers, he said quietly. Junie didn't answer, just stared at him with eyes too old for her face. The man who did this, Minho continued, his voice still soft but carrying an edge of steel beneath it, will never hurt anything you love again. I promise you this. You can't promise that, Junie whispered. Daddy promised he'd come home. He didn't. The words hit like bullets. Alara saw Minho flinch, actually, physically flinch, as if the child had struck him. He reached out slowly and placed one large hand on Junie's small shoulder. Your father didn't choose to break his promise. I will choose to keep mine. Do you understand the difference? Junie searched his face for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. Minho stood, gave Alara a single look that said, keep her inside, and walked out. Through the window, she watched him give his men a series of hand signals, watched them scatter like shadows, watched Minho himself climb into the lead SUV and disappear down the mountain. And Alara understood with terrible certainty that somewhere in these mountains, Silas Vane's time had just run out. 6 days. That's how long it took for Silas Vane's entire world to collapse. Alara didn't see Minho during those 6 days, didn't hear from him. The 2 SUVs remained parked outside the diner, and the 5 specialists rotated guard shifts with military precision, but Minho himself vanished like smoke. On the first day, nothing happened. Alara watched the news, scoured her phone for updates, and found nothing. Just silence. On the second day, the local sheriff was arrested. Something about taking bribes from development companies. The news showed him in handcuffs, being led from his office while reporters shouted questions. On the third day, Vane's business partner was found dead in his Denver penthouse. Apparent suicide, the news said. Single gunshot to the head, no signs of struggle, a note confessing to embezzlement. On the fourth day, the county courthouse was raided by federal agents. They left with boxes and boxes of documents related to illegal land seizures and fraudulent foreclosures. On the 5th day, 3 of Vane's hired thugs were arrested for arson. One of them, faced with a 20-year sentence, started talking, mentioned names, dates, specific fires, including the one that had killed Garrett Vance 3 years ago. Alara had to sit down when she heard that. Her husband's death hadn't been an accident. It had been murder. Vane had ordered it because Garrett had refused to sell the diner property. On the 6th day, the news showed Silas Vane being led from his office in handcuffs. Federal charges, racketeering, bribery, conspiracy to commit murder, arson, money laundering. The list went on and on. But what made Alara's breath catch was the source of the evidence. An anonymous package had been delivered to the FBI. Inside, financial records, recorded phone calls, emails, photographs, witness statements, everything needed to dismantle Vane's empire brick by brick. The news showed footage of the evidence. Alara recognized Minho's methodical precision in it. This wasn't revenge. This was surgery. Careful, calculated, devastating. That evening, Minho finally returned. He looked different. Tired. Well, the kind of tired that came from not sleeping for 6 days straight. But when he walked through the door, his eyes found Alara immediately. "It's done." 2 words. That's all he said. Alara stood from the bar, her throat tight. "Vane? Federal prison. No bail, he'll die there." Minho's voice carried no satisfaction, just finality. "The thug who killed your husband is cooperating with prosecutors. He'll testify that Vane ordered the fire." The room tilted. Alara gripped the bar to steady herself. "Garrett, it wasn't an accident?" "No." Minho stepped closer, and for the first time since she'd met him, his expression softened into something that might have been sympathy. "I'm sorry. You deserve to know the truth." Truth. The word tasted like ash. Her husband had been murdered. For 3 years, she'd believed it was random tragedy. Oh, but it had been Vane. Vane had taken Garrett from her, had taken Junie's father, had created the debt that nearly destroyed them. "Why didn't you tell me before?" Her voice shook. "I needed proof. Suspicion isn't justice." Minho's dark eyes held hers. "Now you have both." Alara didn't know if she should thank him or scream at him, so she did neither. She just stood there, processing a truth that rewrote 3 years of her life. "The property is yours," Minho continued quietly. "The foreclosure is void. Vane's assets are frozen. His company is being liquidated. You'll receive restitution, enough to rebuild, to hire staff, to give Junie everything she needs." "I don't want his money. It's not his anymore, it's yours. Payment for what he stole from you." Minho pulled an envelope from his jacket and set it on the bar. The deed. Free and clear. No debt, no threats. No one will ever take this place from you again. Alara stared at the envelope, then at the man who'd delivered it. "What do you want from me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Minho's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Nothing you're not willing to give." It wasn't an answer. It was an evasion. But before Alara could push, Junie's voice called from the hallway. "Is Minho back?" The child appeared, running toward him with more life in her eyes than she'd had in 6 days. Minho knelt automatically, and Junie crashed into him with the full force of a 6-year-old hug. "You promised," she whispered against his shoulder. You promised the bad man wouldn't hurt us again." "And he won't." Minho's large hand cradled the back of her head with heartbreaking gentleness. "You're safe now. I made sure." Junie pulled back to look at him. "Are you leaving?" The question hit Alara like a fist. She realized she'd been wondering the same thing. Minho looked up at Alara over Junie's head, and something in that gaze made her chest tighten. "That depends on your mother." The SUVs idled in the parking lot like black beasts waiting to carry Minho back to whatever dark world he'd come from. Alara stood at the window, watching his men load their gear with the same efficiency they'd brought to everything else, and felt something crack open in her chest. He was leaving. She'd known this moment would come. Known from the first night that men like Minho didn't stay in places like this, with women like her, in lives that didn't include violence and empires and the kind of power that toppled vultures with a phone call. But knowing didn't make it easier. Behind her, Junie was crying. Quiet tears that broke Alara's heart more than screaming would have. The child had already lost her father. Now she was losing the man who'd kneeled before her, who'd promised to keep her safe, who'd actually kept that promise. Minho stood in the center of the common room, his black coat perfectly tailored, his expression carefully neutral. He looked at the diner that had been his fortress for a week, at the fireplace his men had rebuilt, at Junie's drawings now taped to the walls. "The debt is settled," he said quietly, looking at Alara. "Vane is gone. The property is yours. You're free." Free? The word should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like a door closing. Alara found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. "Is that all this was to you? A debt?" Minho's eyes snapped to hers. For a moment, the mask cracked, and she saw something raw beneath it, something that looked almost like pain. "No." The word was barely above a whisper. "Then what?" He didn't answer, just stood there, fighting some internal battle she couldn't see. Finally, he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of 10 years of guilt. "I failed my sister. I was 3 hours too late. She died because I wasn't fast enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't there when she needed me." His hands clenched at his sides. "I swore I'd never let that happen again, that I'd protect every woman, every child I could, that I'd pay back the debt I owe her by keeping others safe." "So we're penance?" Alara's voice sharpened with hurt she couldn't quite hide. "A way to ease your conscience?" "You were," Minho admitted, and the honesty of it stole her breath. "At first. When I knocked on your door, when you let me in, when Junie offered me her teddy bear, you were another chance to do what I couldn't do for my sister." He stepped closer, and Alara saw his carefully maintained control beginning to fracture. "But somewhere between the storm and the fire, between watching you count $45 like it was your last hope and seeing you stand between your daughter and everything trying to destroy her, you became something else." "What?" The word came out as a whisper. Minho stopped just inches from her, close enough that she could smell sandalwood and smoke on him, close enough to see the scar through his eyebrow, the one Junie had asked about, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body despite the winter cold. "Something I don't have words for." His voice dropped to something dark and rough, something I didn't think I was capable of feeling anymore. Alara's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Minho, I should leave," he said, but he didn't move. "You deserve a normal life, a good man, someone who doesn't have blood on his hands and ghosts in his head, someone who can give you and Junie the safety I've only ever borrowed, never owned." "You asked me what I wanted from you earlier," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm asking you the same question now. What do you want from me?" The question hung between them like a confession. Minho's eyes searched hers, and she saw the war happening behind them. The man who'd built an empire from grief, fighting with the man who'd knelt before a 6-year-old and promised to keep her safe. The predator who'd destroyed Silas Vane without mercy, wrestling with whatever this was that had grown between them in the dark. "I want," he said slowly, as if the words were being dragged from somewhere deep, "to stay." Alara's breath caught. "Then stay." "You don't know what you're asking. My world is dangerous, dark. I can't change that." "I'm not asking you to change." She stepped closer, close enough that they were sharing air. "I'm asking you to stop running from the one place you might actually be safe." Minho stared at her like she'd just spoken a language he'd forgotten he knew. "Safe? You said you needed somewhere safe that first night. You still haven't found it." Alara reached up and touched the scar on his face, the same one Junie had pointed at. "Maybe you've been looking in the wrong places." For a long moment, Minho didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there with her hand on his face and something like wonder breaking across his features. Then he moved. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his scarred cheek. His other hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her against him with barely restrained force. And when he bent his head, when his lips found hers, Alara tasted 3 years of grief meeting 10 years of guilt and combusting into something neither of them had words for. The kiss wasn't gentle, wasn't soft or sweet or careful. It was hunger and desperation and two broken people finding something whole in the wreckage between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Minho rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered. "How to be anything other than what I am." "Then be what you are," Alara whispered back. "Just be it here." From across the room, Junie's voice rang out, bright with joy. "Does this mean Minho is staying?" They pulled apart, turning to find the child standing in the hallway with Bruno behind her, the gentle giant trying to hide his smile. Minho looked at Alara, a question in his eyes. She nodded. He turned to Junie and dropped to one knee again. If your mother allows it. If you allow it. Junie ran to him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and announced to the entire diner, "He's staying! Minho's staying!" Through the window, Alara watched the 5 specialists exchange glances. One of them, the youngest, pulled out his phone and made a call. Within minutes, the men began unloading the SUVs instead of loading them, setting up, settling in, as if they'd known all along how this would end. That night, after Junie had finally fallen asleep, clutching a new stuffed animal Minho had produced from somewhere, after the men had claimed various corners of the diner as their temporary quarters, Alara stood on the porch with Minho beside her. The stars were out for the first time in a week, brilliant and cold and infinite. "We need a new name," Minho said quietly. "For what?" "The diner." He gestured at the weathered sign that still read Peakside Diner. "If I'm staying, if we're making this into something new, it needs a new name." Alara thought about it, about the storm that had brought him here, about the fire that had nearly destroyed them, about the ashes they'd risen from together. "The Guardian's Rest," she said. Minho turned to look at her, and in the starlight his scars looked less severe, his eyes less cold. He looked almost peaceful. "The Guardian's Rest," he repeated, testing the words. Then he smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. "I like it." He pulled her against his side, and Alara let herself lean into his warmth, into his strength, but into the impossible safety of a man who'd walked into her life as a stranger and was choosing to stay as something more. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" "For opening the door." Alara looked up at him, at the man who'd destroyed her enemy and rebuilt her life, who'd promised to protect her daughter and had actually kept that promise, who'd asked for somewhere safe and had somehow found it in the last place anyone would look. "Thank you for knocking," she whispered back. Inside, the diner glowed with warm light. Junie slept soundly for the first time in a week. 5 dangerous men played cards quietly in the corner, their weapons hidden but close. And on the porch, a widow and a monster stood together beneath the stars, choosing to build something new from the ashes of everything they'd lost. The storm had passed. The Guardian had found his rest. And sometimes, Alara thought, the most dangerous strangers turned out to be exactly the salvation you needed. The Guardian's Rest would open for business in the spring, but tonight, it was home. And that was enough.